The sun was already burning the horizon into a dull red glow when the first wagons began to roll into Willow Creek that morning. The wind carried a dry whisper through the plains, a kind of lonely song that only the prairie seemed to know. Dust clung to the wooden signs and the creaky shutters of the old trading post that stood in the center of town, the heart of everything, and yet the place where hearts were rarely kind. Men talked about cattle, horses, and debts. Women traded gossip like currency, and every soul in that place thought they knew everything worth knowing about everyone else. But there was one woman no one really saw anymore. Eleanor Mayfield came to town once a month, always on a Tuesday, always around midday when the sun sat high and cruel. She arrived in her mule-drawn cart that looked like it might collapse if you breathed on it too hard. Her clothes were faded, patched so many times that the fabric had more memory than color. Her boots were cracked, her hands stiff from age, and her eyes, pale blue like the winter sky, had the kind of sadness that no one dared to ask about. When she stepped down from that cart, people pretended to be busy. The store clerk straightened shelves that didn't need straightening. The ranch wives adjusted their bonnets and looked the other way. The men leaned on the hitching post and talked louder, as if volume could erase guilt. Inside the trading post, the air was heavy with the smell of dry tobacco and stale coffee. Eleanor shuffled to the counter with her basket. She placed a few wrinkled bills and some coins beside it, her fingers trembling slightly. Curtis, the young clerk with slicked-back hair and the kind of smile that always hid cruelty, looked down at her money and sighed dramatically. Short again. "Miss Eleanor," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Her voice was soft. "Just a little flour and a bit of salt today, Curtis. I'll make do." He rolled his eyes, counting each coin like it was an insult. "You say that every month. Don't you got family somewhere? Someone to take care of you?" Eleanor shook her head. "Not anymore." "Well, maybe you should think about moving on. This town ain't got much room for charity." A few men near the stove laughed quietly. Eleanor said nothing. She waited for her few items, wrapped them carefully in a piece of cloth, and stepped back outside into the blinding sun. The ground was hot enough to burn through her shoes. She made it only a few steps before the handle of her basket snapped. The loaf of bread tumbled into the dirt, the apples rolled down the steps, and the little bag of flour split open like a wound. People stopped. They saw. And then they looked away. Except one man. Eli Turner had just ridden in from 3 days of hard work and bad luck. He was a tall man, with the kind of tiredness that sits deep in the bones, wearing a hat that had seen better days and boots coated in dust. His horse limped slightly, favoring one leg. He had a torn saddlebag, a few coins in his pocket, and not much left to hope for. But when he saw the old woman kneeling in the dirt, trying to scoop up spilled flour with her bare hands, something in him broke. He knew that feeling, the weight of being invisible, of having no one notice when you fell. He swung down from his horse and crouched beside her. "Here, ma'am," he said, his voice gentle. "Let me give you a hand." She looked up, startled, as if kindness was something she hadn't heard in a long time. "You don't need to trouble yourself." "It's no trouble at all," he said, gathering the apples one by one. "These roads will bruise them worse if we leave them here." Together, they picked up what was salvageable. He brushed the dust from the bread and poured the remaining flour back into the torn bag as best he could. When they finished, Eli lifted the basket and carried it to her cart. "You from around here?" she asked, her voice quivering like the wind through dry grass. "Used to work over at the Carter Ranch," he said. "They let me go last week. Said they couldn't afford another hand." Eleanor studied him quietly, her gaze sharp despite her age. "Hard times have a way of showing who people really are." Eli smiled faintly, tipping his hat. "Guess that goes both ways." For a moment, they stood there, two strangers bound by the same kind of loneliness that hung around Willow Creek, like dust in the air. She thanked him softly, her words almost swallowed by the sound of the wind. He nodded and started to leave, but she called after him. "Mr. Turner," she said, surprising him that she knew his name. "You ride careful now. Storm's coming tonight. I can smell it." He looked up at the clear blue sky and almost laughed. "Doesn't look like it to me, ma'am." She smiled, a faint, knowing smile, It never does until it hits. That evening, Eli found himself riding north, the wind starting to rise around him. By sundown, the sky turned strange. A sickly yellow light spread across the plains, and clouds built up like mountains. He barely made it to the edge of the old Mayfield barn before the storm broke open. Rain came down in sheets, thunder cracking the sky in half. He led his horse inside and found the barn wasn't empty at all. Eleanor sat near a small fire in the corner, her mule tethered close, wrapped in a blanket. She looked up as he entered, her eyes glinting in the firelight. "Well," she said, smiling faintly, "I told you the storm was coming." Eli chuckled softly, shaking off the rain. "You were right about that." He hesitated, not wanting to intrude, but she gestured to the space beside the fire. "Come in out of the cold. No sense in letting pride get you soaked." He joined her, warming his hands. The barn smelled of hay and rain, the kind of smell that reminded him of home before things went wrong. For a while they sat in silence, listening to the storm tear at the world outside. "You live out here?" he asked finally. "Used to," she said. "What's left of the Mayfield place is mine. Been that way a long time. Folks think it's worthless land, but they don't see what I see." He nodded. "Guess people forget easy." "They forget more than that," she murmured. "They forget kindness and decency and how to look someone in the eye without seeing what they can take from them." Her words settled deep in the quiet between them. He didn't know what to say. All he knew was that her voice carried a kind of sadness that didn't come from poverty. It came from being dismissed too long. When the fire began to fade, Eleanor handed him half of a loaf of bread and a tin cup of water. "Ain't much, but it'll fill your stomach for the night." He hesitated. "You don't need to share what little you have." "Maybe not," she said, "but it feels right to." Outside, the storm howled until morning. When Eli woke, the first light of dawn painted the fields in gold. The old woman was already up feeding her mule. "Thank you for the shelter," he said, tightening his saddle straps. She nodded, smiling softly. "You helped me when no one else would. Seems fair we both keep the rain off each other's backs." Eli started to mount his horse, but her voice stopped him one last time. "I have land, Mr. Turner," she said quietly. "More than I can handle alone. It's not worth much to most, but maybe it could be to someone who still believes in working the soil with honest hands." He frowned, not sure if she meant it as an offer or just an old woman's rambling. "That's kind of you, ma'am, but I've got to find work first." "Sometimes," she said, her eyes fixed on the horizon, "work finds you when you do right by others." Eli rode off down the muddy trail, her words following him like the wind. He didn't know that before. The storm had passed, but the town of Willow Creek wore its damage like old scars reopening. Fences lay broken across the fields, the riverbanks overflowed, and half the Carter Ranch's cattle had wandered off into the hills. The air smelled of wet earth and loss. Eli Turner rode into town 2 days after the skies cleared, his horse limping worse than before, his hopes as worn as his boots. He'd gone from ranch to ranch, knocking on doors, asking for work, and finding only rejection. Everywhere he turned, the same words echoed back, "Sorry, no work. Can't afford another hand." But Eli could tell by their eyes it wasn't about money. It was about pride. He was the man who'd been laid off, the drifter, the reminder that anyone could fall.